All right, so the question that gets kind of complicated is if the negative has run a counterplan, let's say that they chose poorly and they've stirred up a hornet's nest, and the affirmative is very ready to debate that counterplan with a lot of offensive arguments. Because I've talked as though the only thing the affirmative should do in answering a counterplan is to debate it on its competition, and that's hardly the case. If the negatives introduced a counterplan into the debate, it's parallel to you introducing your plan into the debate. You can run disadvantages against it. I remember in the late 1990s, my alma mater, Baylor, went to nationals with a new affirmative that they had written to try to bait the trap and get an opponent to run a certain counterplan that they were very, very ready for. They wanted to run this affirmative against a team that loved to run the Japan counterplan, have Japan do the plan instead of the United States. And the plan was to give earthquake assistance to Egypt. The topic was give security assistance, which includes disaster assistance, to a list of countries in the Middle East. And Egypt has earthquakes from time to time, and they don't respond to them very well, and a lot of people die. So Baylor wrote this affirmative that we could help Egypt out with their earthquake response. And what Baylor was hoping for was that someone would say to themselves, there are lots of earthquakes in Japan. Japan is known for building their buildings to withstand earthquakes. They must be really good at earthquake response. At any rate, we'll just assert that, and then we can run our Japanese soft power net benefit, and we'll be good to go. So in the elims of the national debate tournament that year, Baylor ran that affirmative against a very, very good Wayne State team that was favored to go pretty deep at nationals, and Wayne State took the bait. Wayne was known for counterplanning with Japan whenever they got the opportunity, and Baylor said, yes, Japan does have a lot of earthquakes. They do respond to them a lot, and they're really terrible at it. And Baylor had 3 or 4 on-point disadvantages to having Japan do the plan. So this whole discussion is about what do you do in that circumstance? What do you as the negative do? Now, the discussion we had last week of takeouts and turnarounds, it wound up in a discussion of how can you as the negative jettison an argument from the debate. You've started an argument and it turns out that the affirmative knows more about that issue than they do, so they've argued a lot of turnarounds. The turnarounds sound like they're true. It's become an offensive issue that they're likely to win the debate on, so you can go in and you can concede arguments they made. You can agree with arguments they made and freeze them in place as facts, and those can neutralize their turnarounds, and then you can focus your attention elsewhere. That raises the question, can you do that with a counterplan? It's not as clear because affirmative answers do not necessarily make the counterplan go away. Affirmatives can argue things. Their whole set of responses might be, it doesn't complete, it wouldn't solve, it's topical, so you're not allowed to do it, and so forth. And if none of those were impacted, you could just say, okay, the counterplan is still our advocacy, and the affirmative's winning a number of arguments against it, but we're winning that the affirmative plan is a downright bad idea with our disadvantages. And then, maybe you still win the debate in the calculus of which is more desirable, an ineffective counterplan or a disastrous affirmative plan. But in circumstances where the affirmative has made offensive arguments, the counterplan is a really bad idea, is there any way that the negative can disconnect that counterplan and kick it out of the debate? To get to that question, I have to teach you a little bit of a history lesson. Now, to lay the foundation, I am hoping that I'm lucky and that some of you have read this book. I assign this book every time I teach public speaking. Very, very good book, and there's a discussion in it of a generative analogy. And an example of a generative analogy is at Disneyland and at Disney World, they think of what they do as a performance on stage. So they don't have employees, they have cast members. And you're not on the clock, you're on stage, or if you're there preparing to go out and work your shift, you're backstage. And the use of that language tells people what kind of behavior is expected of them, and it helps them to make decisions when they encounter something that they didn't expect. So that's a generative analogy. And I bring that idea into it to say that debate has had its own generative analogies for a very long time. In the earliest days of competitive debate, at least at the college level, either you judged it purely on speaking skills, you regarded it as a public speaking contest and you didn't keep careful track of the substance of the issues. That was one option. But the other option was if you were judging on the merits of the issues, you judged on the stock issues. And the stock issues were a sort of topos system from ancient classical rhetoric. Answer these questions and you can arrive at a rational decision. And back then, a lot of judges, they used that kind of language. They set presumption against the status, or presumption against changing the status quo. So presumption was with the negative, And a lot of times negatives would win debates having done nothing more than having whittled down the stock issues, because they would say the affirmative has got the burden of proof, so we regard the status quo as we would an accused criminal. And if the negative can cast enough doubt on the affirmative's prosecution of the status quo, then we will vote negative. And in the first 10 years of the national debate tournament, I believe, doing this from memory, 9 out of 10 times the negative won. And often all they would win was a partial takeout to solvency and a partial takeout to inherency. They raised some serious questions that the affirmative couldn't answer, and that was it. Negative win. Well, along came 3 debate coaches, and this would have happened sometime in the 60s or 70s. 2 of them are still around today, and I wanted to tell you where they are today. One of them, Alan Lichtman, who is a history professor, professor of presidential history at American University, and he's getting a lot of attention right now because he makes predictions about who's going to win the presidential election, and going all the way back to 1984, he's been right every time. So you'll see him quoted a lot as campaign season heats up. He was a debate coach back in his younger days. So was the author of Where's the Birth Certificate, a man by the name of Jerome Corsi. Lichtman, Corsi, and a third author named Daniel Rohrer, who was the debate coach at Boston College. Unfortunately, he died at a very young age. He was only 40 years old in 1982, so he's no longer with us. The 3 of them got together and came up with a different generative analogy. They said, all of the participants in a debate, including the judge, should think of ourselves as members of Congress. So the affirmative team is made up of 2 sponsors of a bill. The negative team is made up of 2 opposing members of Congress who don't want to see the bill passed. The judge is a member of Congress who hasn't voted yet. There were a lot of implications to this. I'd have to have a longer discussion to talk about all the different ways this influenced debate. But for a while, this was the dominant way to think of debate, because we had policy topics every year, usually phrased as the United States federal government should. The simplest way into that debate was talk about Congress passing legislation. So the policy-making paradigm was pretty much the most widely used way of thinking about a debate. Now, paradigm, a lot of times people think that it's a judging paradigm, but these debate coaches, in talking about it, they disputed that. They said a paradigm is a way of viewing what an ideal debate looks like. It's not a recipe for judging a debate. It's what the debate itself ought to look like. And you might think, well, that's a distinction without a difference, and maybe it is. In another context, if we were discussing it, I could lay out why it really does matter, but anyway, this became widely used by debaters and by judges to explain what was going on in debate and to explain what it was okay to do and what it was not okay to do. Then along came 2 other debate coaches. David Zarefsky, who I believe is still the dean of the School of Communication at Northwestern University, and J.W. Patterson, who was the debate coach at the University of Kentucky, and they said, here's a wild idea. We're not members of Congress, we're college professors. How about if we judge a debate like college professors? We will use a little bit of a generative analogy. We're both in the field of communication. Let's imagine we're professors of political science. It's another social science, and let's treat the resolution as a hypothesis. And we will treat the affirmative plan as an experiment. And the negative has a lot of control over the method by which we will test whether the affirmative plan is desirable. And if the affirmative plan is desirable, then that is some probabilistic, incomplete, but highly suggestive evidence that the hypothesis is probably true. Now, the way you pursue the scientific method, a hypothesis is never finally confirmed. It's just resisted repeated attempts at disproof. You've experimented several times to try to prove the null hypothesis, and you haven't, so there's a lot of evidence backing up the hypothesis that you raised for the purposes of your study. So even gravity is a hypothesis, and I can right now do an experiment. I'm going to try to disprove gravity. If I throw this in the air and it flies up to the ceiling, I will have disproved gravity. Nope, fell into my lap, which means provisionally that one experiment once again temporarily confirmed the hypothesis. But what these 2 debate coaches, Zarefsky and Patterson, what they said was, if we think of debate this way, then presumption is always against the topic, because you never regard the hypothesis as completely proven. It's just until now resisted disproof. They further said any individual experiment is only as important as its own limits, its own context. Each experiment is separate. The fact that one experiment did not disprove the hypothesis doesn't somehow give the hypothesis extra jet fuel to where other experiments are no longer necessary. The fact that that time I threw the pen up in the air and the hypothesis about gravity held firm and it fell into my lap, that doesn't mean that I can just dispense with other experiments. I just go on to the next experiment. And a good skeptical scientist will continue trying to experimentally disprove the hypothesis, and the more times it resists disproof, the stronger the case becomes for it, but more experiments are always in order. So what does that mean, and why am I going on and on and on about it? Because a negative should always be allowed to kick out of a counterplan. Because, according to this judging paradigm, because if the affirmative makes a lot of arguments why this counterplan is a really bad idea, runs a bunch of disadvantages to the counterplan, tries to lock the negative into it, tries to say this counterplan is such a bad idea, the negative should lose the debate for the counterplan, well, a judge who considers himself or herself a social scientist will say, but that's just one experiment. All those disadvantages, that's proving that that one experiment really didn't disprove the hypothesis, but they don't prove the hypothesis itself true. We just move on to the next experiment, which means all counterplans are necessarily conditional. The counterplan is its own independent argument. It doesn't interplay with anything else. If the affirmative wastes a lot of time making tons of offensive arguments, then the negative can just kick out the counterplan, just say, well, that experiment didn't disprove the hypothesis, but we have several other experiments to try. Negatives loved this. Negatives were into this. This was great news for negatives and nightmarishly bad news for affirmatives, because negatives could run 4 or 5 counterplans. They could all contradict one another. And if they ran a counterplan you were really ready for and you spent a lot of speech time making a lot of strong arguments against it, that just meant that they dispensed with that counterplan, kicked it out of the debate, and went for one of the other arguments where you weren't quite as good, and now a lot of your speech time has been wasted because every argument you made against that other counterplan, that counterplan's gone. So affirmatives despise this. Negatives loved it so much that they thought up reasons to support conditionality under other sets of judging assumptions. And so you heard about how under policymaking there'd be test votes, and how legislators made conditional arguments all the time in the political arena, and how in the legal arena you can offer conditional defenses. My client wasn't there, but if my client was there, then it was self-defense. And so running a counterplan conditionally and saying that as the negative you have the right to kick out of a counterplan, to make a counterplan go away if the affirmative's making offensive arguments against it, that was the controversy. And in the video that I have left, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the conditionality, what the arguments against conditionality look like, and how it became a very commonly argued theory argument. And I'll give you one model if you want to think yourself about conditionality bad arguments. But then I'll talk about kind of a compromise that was reached. And it's called dispositionality, and there are a couple of ways to think about it. And the second way, the last one we're going to get to, is an arrangement that really is kind of tidy, kind of easy to think about, and it's kind of a good place to leave the whole what do you do in the end game of a debate in thinking about how do you dispose of a counterplan, what becomes of a counterplan when the judge is making a decision, which of all the options in front of me is the most desirable. So we're almost to the end of this magnum opus. So bear with me a little bit longer and we'll get to the issue that I originally thought that I could illustrate in a way that was kind of easy to follow and concrete.